Hi, I'm Dan Barker. I'm co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, just like that music you just heard, Freedom from Religion. And welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist on Facebook Live. Annie Laurie Gaylor, the other co-president and usual co-host of the show, she's bowing out of today's show because she's still recuperating from a broken heel that happened down in Peru, but she'll be back with us soon. The Freedom from Religion Foundation works to keep state and church separate, and we work to educate the public about the views of non-theists. So we had the show all ready to go, but we have some breaking news just this morning. Just a few minutes ago, we learned that we won our lawsuit against the governor of Texas, Governor Abbott. You might recall that Governor Abbott took down our winter solstice display from the state capitol there in Austin, Texas. We had a permit for it. It had been approved. We had congressional sponsor for it, but he didn't like it. He thought it was a ridiculing Christmas, so he took it down. It was wrong. It was unconstitutional. It was a breach of his authority. And we went to court and sued, and we had won, but we were waiting for the final decision. And this morning, we just got that final decision. The Governor Abbott broke the law, violated our free speech, the free speech of non-believers, by taking down our winter solstice sign. So you'll hear more about this. You can read more on our website later today as we get all the story back together. That's really fun news. If you have a question during today's show, you can ask it right here on Facebook, or you can send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org. Our topic today is, why are so many preachers leaving the ministry? And to help us answer that question, I'm going to be joined today by two members of the Clergy Project. The Clergy Project is an organization formed specifically to help ministers, priests, rabbis, imams, and other religious professionals, and some nuns who no longer believe in the supernatural. First, we have John Compere. John Compere is there on the left, speaking to us from Chandler, Arizona. Hi, John.
Hi, Dan.
John is a former Southern Baptist minister. He's a founding member of the Clergy Project, and he's very active as a vice president on the board and chair of the screening committee, which is a very important committee. So welcome to Ask an Atheist, John.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
I hope your back's feeling better. I know you had a doctor appointment this morning. And we're also joined by Lon Ostrander. He's a former Wesleyan Methodist minister, if I remember correctly. He's currently the president of the Clergy Project. And Lon has been working in Mexico these days. So we're actually talking with him from across the border, from Pachuca, Mexico. Is that right, John, Lon?
That's right, Pachuca, Mexico.
So be careful when you come across the border, Lon, not to bring your grandchildren with you. You know, they might get separated as you cross into our country.
Okay. I wasn't planning on it anyways.
Oh, okay. So before we talk about the Clergy Project, I mean, it's a fascinating story. It goes back to 2011. I first want to ask both of you. You were ordained ministers, and you preached, and you read the Bible, and you studied the Bible. You were authorities on all the Scripture. I want to ask you what you think of Attorney General Jeff Sessions' recent remarks about why the Bible justifies, the Apostle Paul justifies, tearing families apart. Let's look at his remarks that he made just recently.
Persons who violate the law of our nation are subject to prosecution. If you violate the law, you subject yourself to prosecution. And I would cite you to the Apostle Paul and his clear and wise command in Romans 13 to obey the laws of the government, because God has ordained the government for his purposes. Orderly and lawful processes are good in themselves. Our policies that can result in short-term separation are not unjustified.
And then the White House followed it up. Sarah Sanders then actually supported what Jeff Sessions had said.
Where does it say in the Bible that it's moral to take children away from their mothers?
I'm not aware of the Attorney General's comments or what he would be referencing. I can say that it is very biblical to enforce the law. That is actually repeated a number of times throughout the Bible.
So there we go. We have the Attorney General, and we have the White House itself saying it's biblical to do what we're doing. They're using the Bible for public policy. What do you guys think about their use? What do you think, Lon, about using Romans chapter 13 as an excuse to actually tear children away from their parents?
Well, I've got a couple verses for Sarah. Psalm 137:9, happy shall be he that taketh and dasheth thy little ones against the stones. And Isaiah 13:16, their children also shall be dashed to pieces before their eyes. Their houses shall be spoiled and their wives ravished. My comment would be, if the Republican theocrats don't want to be judged as lukewarm cherry-picking hypocrites, perhaps they should work on their follow-through.
So if they were to actually take the Bible seriously, it would be even worse than what they're saying. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, absolutely.
Wow. So what do you think, John? Is this justified to quote the Bible?
All right, there are two responses to that. The first is the laws of the United States are not based on the Bible. The Tripoli Convention of 1797 by first President George Washington, approved unanimously by the Senate and put into place by second President John Adams, said the United States is in no sense founded on the Christian religion. We are a secular nation. So whatever the Bible says should have nothing to do with any action that the United States takes, no matter where you find it. My second response is, if you're going to quote Romans, go back a couple of verses ahead of the 13th chapter, where it says, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him drink. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And then a few verses later in Romans 13, it says, you know the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, shall not kill, shall not steal, do not covet. But any other commandments, and all of them are summed up in this sentence, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law.
You sound
you got to pick and choose. You ought to go a little bit further.
You sound just like a preacher, John. You have many.
Well, I was fifth generation Southern Baptist preacher. The first time I started teaching in college after I left the ministry and got my doctorate, when I finished, I did like this to the students. It's like, you're dismissed, like I used to do in church.
Do we have, Bruce, a picture of John when he was doing a revival service back in there we go, Reverend John Compere. I think that was 1952. You were like a revival preacher at the time.
Yeah.
So I guess what you're both saying is that even though quoting the Bible contradicts our Constitution, it even contradicts the Bible, what he was saying. It doesn't even make any theological sense, right?
Absolutely. It's just horrific misusing of the scriptures. And I think I heard from you that a whole bunch, Jefferson Beauregard Sessions is a United Methodist, the last I heard. And didn't a bunch of Methodist ministers come out with some sort of protest?
I just read this morning, Religion News Service, that 600 United Methodist ministers sent a letter or communicated with Jeff Sessions that he was misusing the Bible to harm children. So even his own denomination is disagreeing with him.
Absolutely.
So good for them.
I feel sorry for Sarah Huckabee Sanders. She has the most difficult job in the world trying to justify this White House.
Yeah, and she has to do it with a straight face. So, so you were Southern Baptist, John, and before we get to the Clergy Project, last week, Vice President Pence spoke. He invited himself to the Southern Baptist Convention, and I understand about a third of them did not want him to come, but he showed up there to give what really amounted to a political speech, I think. But John, let's look at what he said, and then I'm going to ask you what you think about his comments. This is Mike Pence.
Today, on behalf of the President, I want to say thank you. Thank you to the Southern Baptist Convention for the essential and irreplaceable role you play in America. And I'll make you a promise. This President, this Vice President, and our administration will always stand with you.
So, John, you would have been in that audience, right, if you'd stayed in the ministry?
I would have, yes. And the reality is the Southern Baptist Convention 2 or 3 decades ago, after I left the ministry actually, turned very sharply rightward. There used to be some decent, intelligent Southern Baptist ministers, but the fundamentalists decided to take over. They didn't like what was being taught in seminary, and actually for good reason, because seminary taught us to look at biblical criticism, how the Bible came to be, and how it contradicts secular history, etc. And anyway, they didn't like any of that, so they turned sharply rightward, and the more intelligent ministers and many of their churches left the Southern Baptist Convention to form a Baptist Convention that is much more like the best United Methodists and Presbyterians and Episcopal, not as much like the very right-leaning fundamentalist Southern Baptist Convention now. And Mike Pence, of course, himself is a dominionist. He is looking forward to Christians taking over and ruling for 1,000 years, whereupon then Jesus will come. I guess he's a postmillennialist, which is what that is. But he would like to see a theocracy. So if something were to happen and the administration changed and Pence became president, it might even be worse than what we have now. I think what we have now is atrocious.
So you think that's why most of the convention was comfortable with inviting someone like him to speak?
Yes, I do.
Wow, that's pretty scary. So, well, thanks. So the Clergy Project. So, Lon, you are the current president of the Clergy Project. Can you briefly explain to our viewers what is the Clergy Project, what's its purpose, and maybe a tiny bit of the history of it?
Well, the Clergy Project is basically an online community who gives support to clergy who find themselves not believing anymore in God or the Bible, the authority of the Bible. And many of them are still in the pulpit, and so it's a difficult situation.
So were you one of the original founding members, or when did you join in?
No, a little later. The Clergy Project was launched in March of 2011, and I joined in November. And I was screened by Adam Mann.
Yeah, that's a good name. So you were in the first year. And
Yes.
So Adam Mann was a pseudonym of one of our secret, he was in the pulpit still, but he was working secretly as a member of the Clergy Project. And then he came out, his real name is Carter Warden now, and he came out a couple years ago publicly. So you were screened by Adam Mann. So John, you're the chair of the screening committee, right? So explain, what is the screening committee? How does somebody get into the Clergy Project? How do you even know they're legit or any of that?
Okay, I'll do that, but then after that, I want you to come on, since you and Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett and Linda Lascola were the original 4 founders. I want you to say a word about how you came up with the idea and how it got going. What happens is when somebody applies to the Clergy Project, and by the way, we do not advertise. Some people think we ought to advertise more. Our reluctance is we want to be sure we avoid the idea that we're trying to get anybody to leave the ministry or the faith. We absolutely are not. So we screen for 2 reasons. When somebody applies, finding out about it however they do, usually by word of mouth, we screen to be sure the person is who he or she say they are, and not somebody trying to get on to cause mischief. We've had only about a half dozen cases of people who've tried to get on for nefarious reasons, and we are able to ferret that out very easily. The second reason, however, is to be sure that the person himself has come to his own, what we simply call deconversion. And if they haven't, if they're still struggling with that, we refer them to some other online and other groups that they can get in to continue raising those questions about whether they still believe or not. Everybody in the Clergy Project has to be very clear, I no longer believe in God, any kind of God, anybody's God. I once did, and every one of them say the same thing. I was truly committed. It was my life. I loved doing it, but the more I learned about it, primarily from reading and studying the Bible and realizing how I don't think the Bible is a holy book. I think it's a horrible book with a few beautiful passages. But in any event, they have to affirm that they do that. Then we give them a chance, the screeners do, to tell their story. For many of them, it is a very impactful experience to tell their story, because even some who've been out for some time say, this is the first time I've ever told my whole story to somebody who understands what I've been through. Many of them break down in tears as they talk about that, especially if they're newly a member of the deconverted group.
So how many screeners are there?
There are now 9.
Yeah.
We have almost every denominational grouping represented. And we tend to ferret them out to someone who would a Southern Baptist I usually take.
Yeah.
And we, others, we have a nun who takes all the ex-nuns and et cetera. So what we don't have is a screener who is a Muslim or former Muslim.
Well, there's only 2 or 3 I understand have joined, right?
Correct. And the most recent one, I think I was trying to get in touch with him and did, but somehow that fell through. And my hunch is that he decided it was too dangerous. One of the Muslims we did screen said, if I were to be found out as an atheist, I wouldn't just lose my job, I'd lose my head.
So if a liberal clergy contacts the Clergy Project, you would assign that person to a more liberal type. If a Southern Baptist calls, you talk the language. You know how to tell if they're authentic or not, because there's some things a Southern Baptist would never say if they were faking it, right?
That's right.
Or if a Pentecostal fundamentalist evangelical calls, you have different former clergy, members of the Clergy Project who are ex-ministers themselves, actually talk to that person to screen them to come in.
Correct.
Yeah.
Now, Dan, will you tell us how you came up with the idea with Richard Dawkins of starting the Clergy Project, which began in March of 2011?
So yeah, it started in 2011. Went a few years before that. Daniel Dennett and Linda Lascola did a project about preachers who no longer believe, and that article appeared in Evolutionary Psychology. And in order to do that project, they had to find preachers in the pulpit who no longer believe. So how do you find someone like that? You can't just walk up to a church and ask, are you a fake, So one of the things they did was she called me, and I've been in touch with a number of them over the years because they've read my book, Godless, or sometimes I get phone calls that are whispered phone calls from, I'm still a preacher, but I don't believe it. I've never told anybody. So anyway, I was able to give Daniel Dennett, the philosopher, and Linda Lascola, the researcher, his colleague, I don't know, maybe 6 or 8 names, and they used 2 or 3 of those in their study, which was sort of a seed study. They since came out with a follow-up study, and during that same period of time, back in 2006, 7, 8, 9, Richard Dawkins and I had talked, especially in Copenhagen. We did a conference, and he brought it up. He said, what about all these preachers that are in the pulpit that don't believe anymore? How can they find a new job? It must be tough. How can they transition? What about their family? Could we maybe raise some money? So in January of 2011, representative from his organization and Linda Lascola and I, we met at the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., we had a discussion, and we decided, let's start a group. We didn't even have a name yet, but let's start a group to help these former and active clergy. And Richard Dawkins Foundation put up a lot of money to start with the website and do all of that. Then it was mostly volunteers. You mentioned Adam Mann, mostly people within the project. Ironically, Dan Dennett, Linda Lascola, and Richard Dawkins can't be in the project because they are not clergy. They're not former clergy. I'm the only one who was a former ordained minister, so I can be in the project. But they're very happy. In fact, you can go on our website and look at the history and the whole background of how this came to be. So, Lon, what does the Clergy Project do? How does it actually help one of these people? Why did they come, and what resources do we offer to them?
Well, they can share what they're going through on their forums and get some advice from others in the community. We also have a transition assistance grant to help with redoing their resumes and working their way into applications. And through Recovering from Religion, we also have a program that offers up to 12 therapy sessions at no cost to them if they qualify. So we have a number of resources, and of course we have a big list of books that Clergy Project participants have written, and they're helpful in themselves. So.
Can we show some of those books, Bruce? Do you have some of the titles there from some of the Clergy Project members? This is John's book, John Compere, who we're talking with right now. His book, Outgrowing Religion, which that tells your story, John, right, basically, and then why you changed?
Yes.
And then it also is updated. And then here's Jerry DeWitt. Jerry DeWitt is one of the early members. We used to call him a graduate, but that's not quite the right word because we're not like a school. But he was the first member of the Clergy Project to actually come out publicly from the pulpit while he was a member of the project. And he wrote a book called Hope After Faith. I remember talking with Jerry. He's one of the guys who called up with a whispering voice, I'm still in the pulpit. And then we were looking at John Loftus there. John Loftus is a former preacher, why he became an atheist. These are resources that are available. And then Stephen Ewell. Actually, this studio is the Stephen Ewell Friendly Atheist Studio. Stephen Ewell, a former priest, wrote a book called Out of God's Closet, talking about escaping Roman Catholicism. And then in Ireland, Patrick Semple was with the Church of Ireland, the Anglican Church in Ireland. It wasn't Catholic. The rector who wouldn't pray for rain. This is a good read. We had him on our radio show once. It's just a good story about how he left the ministry. A nun, Marion Keneally, and I know, John, you wanted to get her on our show today, but she was not available. There are women involved. And she tells her story of being a nun. And then Mary Johnson's book, An Unquenchable Thirst, as one of the resources. Who else do we have? Oh, well, then Catherine Dunphy wrote a book called From Apostle to Apostate, which not only tells her story, but also gives some background on the Clergy Project, with a foreword by Richard Dawkins. Drew Beckius, who's a former president of the Clergy Project, his pretty new book, I think it's a year old now, The Rise and Fall of Faith, a God-to-Godless story. Greta Vosper up in Canada, she's up in the Toronto area. She stayed in the ministry even though her congregation knew she was an atheist. That's quite a story. They didn't want her to leave. It's a great story. And then also from Canada, Bob Ripley. He's pretty famous personality there. I thought he should call the book Believe It or Not, Bob Ripley, but he's calling it Life Beyond Belief, A Preacher's Deconversion, another really good story. And then here's the book we talked about earlier, Daniel Dennett and Linda Lascola's book, which is the follow-up to their initial study called Caught in the Pulpit. See that preacher with his hands, fingers crossed behind his back there, leaving belief behind. Chris Hyland wrote a book called Life After Faith, a former clergy who has left, and he found the true path, Spirituality with God by Jay Forrest. Any more books that we can show? Carolyn Fairless, The God Presumption, another woman in the group. And then Jason Eden, coming out as an atheist on Facebook. That's me in the corner. And most of you will know the lyrics to that song, Losing My Religion. That's me in the corner, losing my religion. Robert Crompton's book, Leaving Gilead. Yeah. So, and then there's more resources available. Many of them have blogs and podcasts in that. So if you are a minister, former or active, who doesn't believe in God, and you want to be involved, how many members are there now, John?
There are 888 as of last count. And you were mentioning about the women. By the way, it's from all the 50 states plus Puerto Rico. 42 countries are represented. And of our membership, about 14% are women. That's not because we discriminate against women. It's because the church religion has. So there just weren't many, except for nuns in the Catholic Church. And some other denominations nowadays are allowing women to be ordained. But back when, that wasn't the case. So the 14% of membership being women is because of how religion has treated them, not how we do. And of our current membership, about 150 are still currently employed as a religious professional for a variety of reasons. Some because, like one man said to me, he said, I'm 58. How am I going to change careers at this stage of my life? And that's understandable. And some others, for a variety of reasons, think I need to stay where I am for now until I can figure out a path that makes sense for me to do to leave. So about 1 in 5 of our members are currently still employed as religious professionals.
And even in the Clergy Project, we encourage them to use pseudonyms so that there's no risk that they might be outed. Only 1 or 2 of us actually know the real person's name, and then they join with a pseudonym, like Adam Mann did. So, and we encourage them not to reveal too many personal details in case, because it could be damaging if they were outed in their community. In some cases, they were thrown out on the streets and the locks were changed and they didn't have a job. So they have to take it easy. They have to find a good exit strategy. Lon, John told us a little bit about why he left the ministry. Can you summarize very quickly what reasons you had for leaving?
Oh, I think so. Well, the number one reason at the time was I went back to industry to make a living. I actually didn't claim the label atheist until 6 years later. But I had issues with the Bible. I saw the contradictions and the errors, and with my fundamentalist background, I needed the Bible to work, and it was pretty obvious it did not.
So I think we can take some questions from viewers. John, you said there's 888 members now. Is 888 a more secular number than 666, do you think?
It absolutely is. But we sometimes have fun with the 666 number just to get people upset about the demon in the numbers.
So we have a question from Aaron Freeman wanting to know from each of you briefly, why did you join the ministry in the first place? Why did you want to be a preacher?
I'll go first.
Well, I'll go first. I was at a church camp, and officials of the district I think they were giving a treasurer's report, and I was not paying attention, didn't interest me in the least. But for some reason, out of the blue, I had the very distinct feeling that God was tapping me on the shoulder, and calling me to go into the Christian ministry. And it was very vivid. And so I went home and I told my wife, and she was overjoyed. And then I followed up with the district officials and began taking courses through Indiana Wesleyan, and took all 26 courses, and preached only for about 6 years. And then I was out.
So did you actually believe, did you pray? Did you think you saw answers to prayer or miracles, or did you get a inner witness of the Holy Spirit, or was it just something you were just talking about?
No, I actually believed and I certainly prayed. There was certainly a shortage of answers to prayer, but my default position was always that I believed in God.
So, John, you were raised in it, right? You're fifth generation Southern Baptist preacher. Was that part of the reason, or did you have your own personal conversion?
I don't actually remember. I remember going down to the front of the church when I, quote, became saved and shaking my father's hand. I was 8 or 9 or something like that. But then religion was not just something we believed in my family of origin. Religion was our life. I mean, we didn't even celebrate birthdays because that wasn't religious. Celebrated Christmas, but only in the religious sense. So religion, it was the food I ate and the water I drank and the air I breathed. I didn't know anything different, and I didn't rebel against it because it was all I knew, and because in church I began speaking up in Sunday school and other things, and everybody said to me, "Oh, you're going to follow your dad and be a preacher just like him." It's just all I never considered anything else. So I was ordained at 18 when I was in college and began serving a country church. I'd already gone to Alaska with the Home Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention to work among the Eskimos for one summer, and I went for a subsequent summer. So it's just, I was all in until the first doubts struck when I was already ordained and already serving as a minister.
So you say you were all in. Were you actually feeling like you were really talking with this God character who was talking with you in some form and relating to your life in some way? Or were you just preaching what the Bible said?
I was preaching what the Bible said, and I also was preaching out of a sense of guilt. I didn't know why I was such a worm but I knew I must be. So, I did my doggonedest to try to be as good a person as I could be. For instance, I had no teenage rebellion years. I never touched a drop of alcoholic beverage until I was well out of the ministry. It was all I knew. And I do remember thinking, God has never spoken to me. If he's spoken to these other people, it must be in a language I can't understand. I was sincere and genuine and worked my hardest. But the main thing was I was good at it. It came naturally to me, and people said, "Oh, you're going to be the next Billy Graham. You're wonderful."
Well, I've seen you give some talks that are pretty, if I can borrow a word, inspirational. You have that, what do you call it, the stage charisma thing of a minister. So somebody here is asking, Brian Anderson, what was the reaction? We only have a few minutes left, but from both of you, was there a reaction from your flock in your community when you announced that you were leaving?
Lon, you go first.
Well, I mentioned that I had already left my flock years before I actually took the label atheist. So mainly I had to deal with my reaction from the family, and my wife is still not coping with my new perspective very well, and it's been 11 years.
Well, when I left, 3 years before I left, I was in my second pastorate after seminary, and I knew I didn't believe in the virgin birth. I didn't believe Jesus was God's son. I didn't believe his death had anything to do with whether there was a heaven or a hell. I knew I didn't believe in a heaven or a hell, but I just hadn't figured out how to do it yet. And the church was growing, and they were happy as can be, and the money was coming in, etc. So when I finally resigned, I didn't tell my church I no longer believed. I thought that would be cruel. It was a fairly conservative Baptist church, even though I was not a conservative Baptist. I said to them, I'm doing a lot of counseling. I had taken clinical pastoral education, and I need to be better at it. And so I'm going back to school to try to become a more effective change agent. That was the truth. It just wasn't the whole truth. I didn't say to them, I no longer believe. They now know many, many years later, and I've gotten emails and phone calls and so forth from a ton of them, most of them being supportive and saying, we can understand how you came to this position, even though we don't share it. And some of them saying, we also share it. It has happened to me also, so I'm not surprised that it happened to you. But I did not say at the time, I have become an atheist. In fact, Dan, you are the reason I became comfortable using the word atheist.
Really?
I would use agnostic. I had read a book by Leslie Weatherhead, I think out of print, called The Christian Agnostic. And he said, Christian agnostic is someone who is immensely attracted to the Christ story and who says about anything that hasn't validated itself in his experience, I'll put that in a mental drawer labeled awaiting further light. Well, I kept doing that until that mental drawer was so full it wouldn't close. But when I thought of the term atheist, I thought that meant somebody who could say, I'm 100% sure no God exists. And you told me that's not what atheist means. Atheist simply means I have no belief in any God figure. And okay, if that's so, that's me. I have no belief in any supernatural being at all. So because of you, I'm comfortable using the term atheist.
Well, don't blame me. You did your own thinking, didn't you? So both of you are saying that in most cases, and I think this is true with the members of the Clergy Project, you need to find an optimal or comfortable exit strategy. You need to find some way, and some of them go into nonprofit work, which tells their church and family, hey, I'm still doing good work for the community. Or like you, John, went into counseling, or maybe they go into philosophy. But you need to find some way to ease out or get out of the ministry and land on your feet.
Right.
Is that kind of basically what most of the members are dealing with in the Clergy Project?
Most of them have already
That's
dealt with
about
that because most of them are already out. But those who are still in, that's exactly what they're dealing with.
Yeah.
How do I do this in the least costly way?
You were going to say something, Lon?
Yeah, one of our most recent participants had the foresight to go back to school and study so he could become a special education teacher. So while he was still serving the church, he was getting educated and planning for another vocation. So that worked well for him.
Wow. Well, I suppose that works too, and it shows that he cares about humanity. We have a question from Janice Green, who is watching the show. Do you feel it has become significantly more common for religious leaders to leave the pulpit, and do you foresee this trend to continue? What do you guys think?
I think the trend will continue. I think it will explode. I think the clergy are the very tip of the iceberg.
My thought is that it will increase if we were to advertise the Clergy Project widespread. I'm sure we would get a great abundance of more applications. As I said earlier, the reason we don't is we want to be sure we don't cross the line of trying to influence anybody to leave his or her faith. We're not going to do that. We're just going to be here for them when that's happened to them. But more and more young people are signing up as nuns, N-O-N-E-S. I don't have any religion. And the mainline churches are suffering, and even the fundamentalist churches, the great, huge churches, they are beginning to lose some of their members. So I think increasingly that the more educated ministers become, the more they will see this really does not cohere, and I can't keep doing this without risking being publicly phony and privately cynical, which is what happened to me.
So we know from experience that there are pulpits across America, around the world right now, that are filled by non-believing clergy. They used to believe, but they don't anymore. They're standing up there. Well, I used to do that. For 4 or 5 months, I used to be a total hypocrite. And some of them are in the pulpits. They don't know what to do. They're stuck. Do either of you have a rough estimate about what percentage of pulpits across the country might contain these agnostic or non-believing clergy?
At least 25%.
You think so?
maybe more, but at least 25% among the well-educated ministers. Now, those who've only gone to Bible school and are just fundamentalists and have no other education, don't have a scientific bent, it's not that high there. But among well-educated mainline ministers, in fact, this is from a Jewish rabbi who said, in answer to the question, how will my congregation react if they find out I'm an atheist? He said, they won't care. He said, they won't give a shit because they say I'm an atheist too. I'm just ethnically a Jew and I love all the ceremony and stuff, but I don't care if you don't believe.
Yeah. Well, you know the old joke, what do you call a Jew who doesn't believe in God? A Jew.
There you go.
So are you saying that if I'm driving down the average street in America and I pass a number of churches, a quarter of them might have non-believers in it, or just of the educated ones?
I would say of the well-educated,
Okay.
seminary-educated ones, that would likely be true. And many of them would not say, as I was reluctant to do for so many years, I'm an atheist. They would just say, well, you ask them, do you really believe there's a hell where everybody who hasn't, quote, been born again into Jesus is going to fry like a sausage for eternity? And they'll say, no, of course not. No intelligent person believes that. So they may not be all the way through to saying Jesus was not raised from the dead, but although many of them, knowing how contradictory all the scriptures are about that, many of them would say that. But I think at least a quarter of the well-educated ministers are somewhere along the agnostic line.
Yeah, but if there's no God, who pops up the next Kleenex? Have you ever thought of that? When you pull out the Kleenex, where does it come from? They must have some answer to that question. Who made everything? How did it all come into existence if there's no God? So
Lon,
we have.
you want to take that?
No, that was just a dumb question. Sorry.
No, it wasn't done. Let me respond to that. The reality is, if you think God, if you believe in God, where did he come from? Oh, he didn't come from anywhere. He was just eternal. Why not? Where did the universe come from? It didn't come from anywhere. It's just eternal. It makes just as much sense, in fact, more. Because we know the universe exists.
At least one of them does, yeah. So I guess I'll ask Lon this. This is a question from Greta Ames. Even though you are no longer a religious leader, do you still have any residual beliefs in any of the church's teachings? What do you think about that? Oh, I think Lon,
Okay.
I guess we're losing some kind of a bandwidth here, connection.
I don't have any residual beliefs in any of the church's teachings that would contradict my own secular views. So, yeah.
So, Lon, we're having trouble with the transmission of your video here, so we're only got about half of what you just said. But I think you said you don't no longer have any residual beliefs in any of that. John, is there any verse of the Bible? I could name one or two, but is there any verse of the Bible that you would still find useful today?
Though I speak with the tongue of men and of angels and have not love, I am become a sign. All of 1 Corinthians 13 is gorgeous. There's some places in the Sermon on the Mount that are good, but love your neighbor as yourself. I mean, that is not unique to Christianity by a long shot, but it's the guiding principle we need to use. Do not be overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. And in this regard, let me just tell you about how your family reacts. My family, absolutely, my mother and father, both of whom were as integrous believers as I have ever met, they refused to believe that I no longer believe. My mother said, John, you can't be an atheist. "You're such a good person." In her mind, atheist meant bad person. And I finally quit discussing it with them. And when I would go back to visit, they lived in Mississippi. And when I would go back to visit, and my dad would be going to deliver a scripture memory. He memorized the whole Gospel of Mark, all 16 chapters. And he would deliver as much as I would sit still to listen to. And he would want me to go with him and sing, "I walk today where Jesus walked." And I would do it. Not that I believed a word of that, but I believed in him and I was honoring him. And so it was that way until their death.
Yeah, because don't you think most believers are good people? In spite of their Bible, most Christians and Jews and Muslims are basically just good people. And they want
about the same percentage as in the normal population, probably no more, maybe no less.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think we're out of time here. Lon Ostrander is the current president of the Clergy Project, and John Compere is a vice president on the board and the chair of the screening committee for the Clergy Project. Can you tell us quickly how someone can contact the Clergy Project if they want to? There's a public Facebook page as well for non-members to join, but how could somebody get involved in the Clergy Project if they want to?
Just go on clergyproject.org, which is a public site, and it has a place to click there. If you are a clergy and you would like to apply, you click on that and follow the form, and we'll get it and respond to you within 24 hours. We're all volunteer, by the way. We have no money to pay any staff. So if anybody wants to decide to make a contribution, we would appreciate it. We have to pay some insurance bills and other things. And those of us who are members contribute, most of us do on a monthly basis to pay what few expenses we have. But if we continue to grow, which I think we will, eventually we'll need to hire some staff, and so we'll have to have some funding for people who believe in what we're about. Well,
thank you, Lon and John. It was really fun, and thanks for all the good work you are doing. Maybe we'll have you come.
Thank you, Dan, for starting the Clergy Project. We owe it all to you. And in fact, I had an application that I sent you a brief copy of that says right here, "In utter exhaustion from the fundamentalists bickering about the trivial, and because of my secret doubts about the whole thing called God, I didn't cross the line of deconversion until a year later that I downloaded Dan Barker's Godless." Wow. You talk about salvation, haha. But seriously, it was like Dan was detailing my journey. If I could point to the moment I saw the light, it was the watershed moment of my deconversion. I was so relieved. No more guilt, no more mental anguish. And he goes on.
Wow. So we're all still evangelists, aren't we? But this time we truly have some good news to tell, don't we?
We do.
Well, thank you, Lon. Muchas gracias por estar con nosotros, Lon, on the show.
See, Donato, my pleasure.
Okay, and thank all of you for watching FFRF's Ask an Atheist. You can check out our other weekly show. It's called Free Thought Matters, which is a broadcast TV show, as well as Ask an Atheist on FFRF's YouTube channel. You can find this current show. It'll be up later today sometime. And don't forget about our convention coming up in San Francisco on November 2nd through 4th. Some of the speakers include the eminent writer Salman Rushdie, the former director of Planned Parenthood, Cecile Richards, Mythbusters host Adam Savage, John Delancey there on the right. He's of Star Trek fame, the actor, Ex-Muslims of North America co-founder Sarah Hayder, the irreverent actress, Saturday Night Live alum Julia Sweeney, and there in the middle, the award-winning stand-up comedian Leanne Lord will also be there. And then also appearing will be Ensaf Haidar, the activist wife of a Saudi freethinker whose persecution and imprisonment have caused global outrage. It's a very packed convention. The rooms are already getting booked. The registration is almost full, so if you want to go, please sign up. You can register online today at ffrf.org/outreach/convention. And if you want to receive FFRF text alerts on your smartphone, you can send a text, FFRF, send that text to 52886. and data rates might apply to that. Again, that's text FFRF to 52886. We'll see you next week for another episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist.